I feel Black Genius is a therapeutic expression that I think oftentimes the person emoting isn't aware of that at all.
We found Everyday People Take One when it was called Some
That's the
People.
audio that runs through.
That's the audio that runs
Yeah.
through.
Wow.
The movie ends with Stand, Take One, which is just Sly at a piano. You know, have that beat digger DNA.
There's a moment in D'Angelo's eyes where he and I are having a subtextual conversation where, you know, he's looking at me like, oh, so this is what you want to ask me?
Yeah.
Do you believe in the concept of Black genius?
Black Genius?
What's up, everyone? I'm Damien Scott. I'm the Deputy Editorial Director at Billboard, and today we have two very special guests. I'm joined by the Academy Award-winning duo, Ahmir Questlove Thompson
Yes.
and Joseph Patel, the director and producer of the groundbreaking work, Sly Lives.
Yes.
I'll say the whole title, just so everyone knows when you see it.
Yes.
Sly Lives, AKA The Burden of Black Genius.
Yes.
Thank you
Thank you for having us.
for coming through to Billboard today. Most people know Sly Stone as an innovator. You know, he's the guy who essentially blended all of the popular genres together to create this newfound gumbo that became what became basically American pop music in a way. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose to focus on Sly right now?
I believe that we chose Sly, or Sly chose us. Sly is in a very unique position in the American music pantheon. And Sly is essentially the first Black megastar kind of in an era, and I'll say this lightly with air quotes, where there were supposed to be no limits. Sly's success is a little bit different than Ray Charles or Chuck Berry or James Brown, anyone that was entertaining during either the Reconstruction period or the Civil Rights period. So Sly is basically kind of the embodiment of what Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was about, like this utopian, multiracial mix of black and whites, men and women together. And what he does with that journey, I believe, is the first domino in many of stories. So this is not just the Sly story. This is the story of almost every Black creative we know.
You know, I'm very curious how it affected both of you, but Joseph, how did his music affect you, and what about his music brought you to the project?
Really, I'm in service to Ahmir's story. I think Sly was really one of the formative artists of your lifetime. Mm-hmm. For me, it's like a generation later. Like Parliament Funkadelic was my thing that I was obsessed with. Okay. So I kind of came to this story not knowing a ton about Sly. And it took me like a year to catch up to even a fraction of where Ahmir was at. And I think that perspective was healthy for our storytelling, because I wasn't as deep in the weeds as he was. And so I could bring a perspective to the story that was what a typical viewer might be, and just sorting out, you know, what was important, what's not important. And I think, you know, having that, like I knew the music, but I didn't know the story.
Right.
And
right.
I think,
same.
Yeah, and so, and then once you know the story, it's like the depth of the story, the extrapolation of Sly's story to other artists is the first thing Ahmir said when we talked about it. He's like, I don't want this to just be about Sly Stone. I want it to be about every Black artist since, including himself, including his peers. And that's you know, as a storyteller, it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
But one you want to take on.
So I definitely want to get back to that, about how, you know, this story bleeds into the future and the present. But I'm super curious for Quest. How did you, if you can remember, your first introduction to his music?
My very first memory in life
Wow.
has a Sly and the Family Stone soundtrack. And weird enough, it's probably the spookiest Sly song ever. There's a song, the second song on There's a Riot Going On, called Just Like a Baby.
I think my first experience with Sly was at a barbecue, but not
as it should be.
but not at the barbecue.
Oh.
I was like inside, and my aunt was like sitting down in a room by herself, just listening to his version of Que Sera,
Que
Sera.
Sera, yeah.
And she was like by herself in a room, and I was like, well, this is spooky.
But the thing is that one of Sly's gifts was his creative stickiness, and I definitely know that one of the first albums from start to finish that I would sit and listen to was pretty much like the Sly and the Family Stone greatest hits album that they made to sort of cash in or catch up the Woodstock audience to what Sly's been up to since '67 that might have missed the boat for those first 2 years. That was the party album. That was the very first, now that's what I call music compilation. Literally, there's not a loser in the bunch. You could play from start to finish. And it was the greatest party album ever.
Curious for the both of you, he's such a misunderstood genius. During his time, after his time, I'm curious, what was the most difficult part of his personality to get through? Like, what was the most misunderstood part of him, do you guys think?
The thing that all of us grappled with was that he still had fear and stage fright.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
And oftentimes, a lot of us, and I go through this as well, like most artists do have a fake it till you make it / imposter syndrome / Clark Kent Superman thing going on with themselves, this duplicitous behind the door, closed doors, you're a fraidy cat, but then you gotta just, okay, Geronimo, and literally just jump into whatever unknown waters that you're about to jump into.
I mean, same thing. It's like, how does someone who, Sly loved music, loved making music, how does someone who loves making music like that get to the point where they don't want to do it anymore? Right. That to me was the really interesting part. But, what Ahmir talked about is that thing that Sly went through, being in the spotlight and not knowing how to deal with it, and the anxiety and guilt that comes with it. Our first conversation about the film, he was like, I go through that. Andre goes through that. D'Angelo goes through that. Erica goes through that. It was something he very easily recognized.
I mean, D'Angelo, Andre, seeing them in the documentary, you're almost like, it's like the Spider-Man meme.
But also,
it's like, look, it's you.
Seeing them recognize that they're not there just to talk about everyday people.
Yeah.
Like, there's a moment in D'Angelo's eyes where he and I are having a subtextual conversation where, he's looking at me like, oh, so this is what you want to ask me?
There's a part where I forget what the question you ask him, but he's like, I don't know, Yoda. Like, I don't know. Like, how am I supposed to know this?
Yeah, it was a process. I'll probably say the hardest part of the film, because we always wanted kind of Sly's second or third generation progeny to kind of answer for him, because they go through it too. And getting people to feel safe enough to share that was probably the hardest part of this entire process. Like the amount of ledge talking, the amount of hair pulling, the amount of tears shed, the amount of arguments waiting. Like it was like we subjected ourselves to a lifetime of dealing with Sly Stone via his children. But it's also, I always dreamt of a moment in which I could have an intervention talk with a lot of my creative circle, people that might not be aware that they are cracking at the seams or that they could be sabotaging themselves.
Joseph, if you could, very similar to your other documentary, the archival footage was just incredible. What's the process of getting that? How tedious of a process is that? How hard of a process is that to get all that stuff? How did you even find a lot of that stuff?
I mean, it's interesting with Slides. It was a little different than Summer of Soul, because Summer of Soul, right, it wasn't very well documented, right? With Sly, he was in the spotlight, he was the biggest star in the country for a while. But what's interesting is he's in an era where like there wasn't like home video. There's very little home video footage. A lot of it's on TV, right? Ed Sullivan and what was Mike Douglas and
yeah.
Midnight Hour and things like that. But like, you know, Greg Arico, the drummer, took some 16 millimeter footage when they went to London, and you know had been sitting in his storage unit since he took it. He hasn't really shown anybody, and so you know being able to access that was cool. And you know Sony Music gave us access to the studio reels of Sly's early recording sessions. So we started going in the studio about a year before we started the movie, and we would just sit there in the room and listen to stuff that was unmarked, just pulling random numbers. And it's like we found Everyday People Take One when it was called Some
That's the
People.
audio that runs
That's the
through.
audio that runs
Yeah.
through. The movie ends with Stand, Take One, which is just Sly at a piano. Like,
Amazing.
getting to hear really incredible stuff. Some of it is, like, it's a digger's mentality, right? It's like we're all, Ahmir, myself, Jeff Mauer, our story producer, we're all, you know, have that beat digger DNA. So it's the same thing. It's just with video footage. But, you know, some of it is luck and some of it is just sort of knowing where to look.
Was there anything that you found that, you know, was too? You mentioned earlier that, you know, this was the
Too hot to put
yeah,
in.
like this. You're like, this is like
Oh
the,
my
the-
God.
Don't ask
this is
me
the
that question.
cleanest
Don't ask me
thing.
that question.
This is the cleanest thing we could have made.
Probably the one of the most jaw-dropping discoveries was Sly in 1974, and this is one thing that most celebrities grapple with. Like, at what point does your celebrity sort of surpass your artistic contribution?
Right.
Where you just become, you know, cult of personality, where you're just famous for being famous.
Right.
And, you know, the height of like Sly's personality phase is like kind of 1974, you know, some 5-6 years after Woodstock, where he's now just part of the American fiber. And it's sort of the culmination of it is his wedding at Madison Square Garden.
Right.
And this is where they just went all out, like the best designers and, you know, the top models and everything. Like, the spectacle is going to happen at Madison Square Garden. And I guess at the wedding rehearsal, they realized, like, wait a minute, if we're the wedding party, who's going to be the band that's going to play, like, Here Comes the Bride and that sort of thing? So there's a reel that's marked off. They go in the studio at like 1 a.m. to try to figure out what song to play so that it can play during the wedding.
Oh, okay.
And so they're doing an amalgamation. They're doing a mixture of Family Affair and Here Comes the Bride. But as with most of those reels are really an amazing thumbprint on Sly's creative process. Because it's not like the engineer's stopping the reel, like he's just letting it run as Sly's figuring it out in real time. And some, like in the case of Everyday People, it's a whole nother song, whole nother rhythm, and then somehow it just morphs into what we know it now. But to watch them try to grapple with a song so simple as Here Comes the Bride and the struggle of it all, and you just hear it, and you hear the indifference in Sly's voice, almost to the point where I'm like, hearing that, I was like, this marriage is not going to last even a year.
Right.
He's just like, motherfucker, just, come on, man, just get it together. 3, and dun, 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 dun. No, motherfucker. So just to hear the 1 hour process of them trying to figure out Here Comes the Bride and Family Affair, that was rather mind blowing to me.
It reminds me of the scene where they talk about the Radio City show, where they're, you know, she's like, there's 200 people in the audience.
Their worst show, yeah.
We were off. She's like, I just left.
You can hear the emptiness in
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I can't
hear
imagine
the emptiness inside of that theater. Like,
I've only been to Radio City when it's been packed to the rafter. I can't
Right.
imagine 200 people sitting in Radio City.
Every band member said that it was their worst show, and you know we asked them all separately, and that was their worst show.
That
yeah.
is I'm curious how you both settled on the formatting of the documentary. Like, what went into trying to, story-wise and visually, like what was the process in landing on that for you guys?
You know, before Summer of Soul, Ahmir and I talked about what kind of movie we wanted to make. And he said, you know, it should look like a Public Enemy album. And then we got our editor, Josh Pearson, who's a genius, and we ran it back for this one.
Yeah.
It has that feeling of a Public Enemy album, right? Sample heavy, dense, cutty.
Usually with every project, I like to start backwards.
Interesting. Okay.
Because my first thought to any album or film project or book or whatever is what's the feeling that I want for people to have when it's over.
I think very early on we wanted to tell Sly's story with a lot of empathy. I think for a couple of reasons. One is because a lot of his story that people do know and that other people have tried to make docs about, it just sort of doesn't humanize him at all, right? It just treats him like a punchline.
Right.
And I think that framework we discussed really early on was like, we need to look at his story with a lot of empathy. That's why, like, you know, we could have done a Sly doc that was 20 hours of drug stories, but, you know, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to explain his genius, right? And I think one of the things that was really fun for us to work on with Josh is, how do we deconstruct this song so that you, the viewer, understand why Sly is a genius?
Right.
It's not just a half hour of people saying he's a genius. It's showing you what went into it, right?
Yeah. It's like, oh, we need a
He's so
simple
genius
song.
that it actually makes us look like geniuses constructing it.
You know,
No, that's a great point. Like the point where they talk about
Rhythm Nation.
that and
Dance
dance,
to music,
and he's
yeah.
like, "Oh, we need a simple song." He's like, "All right, I was like, what's simple then?"
Yeah.
He's like, "This is simple to him, not to most people." It's very fascinating to watch how that came to be.
Yeah, I mean, Niall says it's very hard to write a hook, but Sly's got like 4 hooks in this song.
Yeah.
And then Jimmy and Terry individually, which, by the way, I want to point out, a very inspired idea that Ahmir had. He's like, if we're going to interview Jimmy and Terry, we should do it separately so that both of them talk, not just one of them.
Yeah. That was great.
And that, you know, Jimmy's talking about hooks and the sing-songiness is what causes the earworm. And Terry's like, you know, but when you hear the harmonizing, it brings you back to church. And it's like, and then Jerry's like, it's like the Motown beat, but not. Like, I love that part of the film because it's like, as a viewer, you'll walk out and understand
Why
how
things work.
complicated this simple song is, right? And I think that's part of our evolution as storytellers is to not just be the smartest person in the room, but to give that to you as a viewer.
He brings up a great point. Oftentimes, we look down on pop music because, you know, it's almost like pedestrian, like, oh, you know, your kid sister knows that, and, you know, but is she hip to this
Right.
Captain Beefheart, you know, experimental record over here? And I maintain that, like, writing simple songs, writing simple, effective 3-minute songs is the hardest challenge. Like, anyone can do, and this is not to be, like, you know, reductive to Miles Davis's, like, electronic period and all this stuff, but, you know, people, it's way easier to do, like, artistic fusion jazz records and whatnot. So hard to just be limited with just, you know, in a MacGyver way. I hope that's not too over reference. To be very limited in your resources and to make something effective.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm told we're on our last question, so
Let
there's
him
a,
ask.
there's a
Go
part of the documentary, you know, you ask everybody, you know, what is Black genius and how does, you know, the burden of Black genius, but you don't answer it yourself.
Right.
So I'm curious, like, what is the
I
Black
didn't
genius to
know
you?
the answer, so that's I wanted to ask them. I feel Black genius is it's a therapeutic expression that I think oftentimes the person emoting isn't aware of that at all. It's a feeling, and it's a different feeling because oftentimes we're not offered the space to express ourselves. So that's what I think it is.
Thank you guys so much for coming through. I
you.
appreciate it. The documentary is amazing. Everybody go check it out. Sly Lives, AKA The Burden of Black Genius, on Hulu on February 13th. Thank you.